Generally, starting a board game video is easy. Games have themes, and those themes have a hook.
Hey, do you want to play a board game where the moon crashed onto Earth and now there's giant samurais with swords fighting dragons? Well, do you?
With Eurogames, however, things are a little bit more complicated. For example, today's game Maracaibo is all about sailing a boat in the 17th century in the Caribbean, delivering goods, engaging in military skirmishes, exploring uncharted territories, and sir, how dare you call me a pirate? If you're not familiar with Eurogames, they're essentially solitaire puzzles where the best hope of interaction you have with your friends is maybe a passive-aggressive knock-on effect because someone took a resource that you wanted or maybe landed on a spot where you wanted to go. You're not so much fighting against them, you're just fighting to be better than them. As games, they are frequently intricate, with many interlocking mechanisms and sometimes requiring quite a bit of rules overhead. I love Eurogames, but they can be a little bit of a hard sell because theme is at best a tertiary concern. Don't get me wrong, it can do theme, but it's a bit like asking a chimp to wield a lightsaber. It has the ability to do it because, you know, opposable thumbs, but only the most ardent of chimp enthusiasts will be delighted with the result. A much better hook for cardboard aficionados is mentioning the designer's name. For example, if we said that Maracaibo is the new heavy Euro game from Alexander Pfister, I said Maracaibo is the new heavy Euro game from Alexander Pfister. And now you know that we mean business. Get ready for some chunky rules talk. The central conundrum of Maracaibo revolves around sailing through the Caribbean. Each time your turn comes along, you get to take to the seas around this one-way circle of various villages or cities in the archipelago. You can sail anywhere between 1 or 7 spaces, but any space you skip, you can never come back to. This round, what space you land on determines what you can do, and the rules are different based on whether you land in a city or a village. Generally in cities, you will be able to find Ayo sushi, and in villages, not so much. Wait a minute. No, that's right. Each city has a unique action that will let you engage with one of the game's scoring tracks or provide you with resources. They can even be different between each game or fall into a different distribution. Additionally, each city rewards you for reaching it earlier than any of the other players. If you have a card in your hand, and a lot more on these a little bit later, with a matching good, you can spend that good and take a disc from your player board and plonk it down proudly like a flat wooden brown rosette of achievement. The disc itself does nothing for you. It blocks that space for others to make a delivery since the city no longer needs that crappy corn you've got stewing in your salty barrels. The action of taking the disc off is another story. Your personal player board is a ship, although I won't blame you if you mistake it for student accommodation because it features an absolute mess of abilities and bonuses. A part of fun of Maracaibo is untangling this mess, and even though through the course of the game you will be able to unlock about 3/4 of all of these abilities, it's choosing the order in which you do it that really rounds out your booty. Elaine made me have all these pirate puns. Each turn, you'll begin with your hand loaded with 4 cards. These itself have a various set of features, and choosing what you spend them on is another puzzle altogether. Would you like a wider selection of cards? That's not a problem. Just unlock the 6-card hand limit bonus, and One-Eyed Bob's your uncle. Refilling your hand at the end of your turn is a simple matter of drawing cards from the top of the deck, or you could alternatively pay 1 coin per card to select them from the display. This way you can ensure that you have, for example, the right good to deliver to the next destination. Yes, the goods, remember those? They are still the root of this entire conversation, and cards have other features such as permanent abilities or occupations that you can later turn in for quests. But what if you didn't want to pay any money for having the right to choose which card you want? That ability is also available. Talking of abilities, these cards have various powers or effects that you can build, which is a weird term for playing a card, especially considering that most of these cards are people, as if you're literally building humans. Not to mention that one of the cards is called a Master Builder, and to get him to Master Build, you first have to build him. When you build cards, they'll become permanent changes to rules, or they'll increase your income, or grant you a new village action, or become a new location on the main board where you can stop and do something that's not available for anyone else, like a naughty little secret just between you and the game. The trouble is building these cards costs dollars, dosh, doubloons, and it's a resource that disappears quickly, especially at the start of the game when your enterprise isn't quite established yet. Would you like a little bit more money maybe? That's okay, you can have it if, you guessed it, take discs off your player board. And that's half of what happens when you go to a city, because the other half is taking the action itself, and there's a whole host of those, but we'll talk about some of them later. And if you're saying to me right now, Efka, did all of those rules explanations spring from a tiny bi-rule of a rule which dimensionally represents only 1 squared centimeter of the board that's 56 squared centimeters itself, which makes up exactly 3,136 of it, then my answer is yes, it did. But that's just how this game rolls. Mechanisms cascade into mechanisms cascade into mechanisms, which were the original mechanisms cascading into mechanisms, and from a physics perspective, it makes about as much sense as the Penrose stairs, or in fact, building the Master Builder. But now let's talk about village actions. Villages are any spaces that aren't cities, and stopping on any one of them will offer you an identical suite of actions. Except of course that suite increases if you take discs off your player board, or build other cards. You can either take a coin, discard your hand of cards to get 2 coins, or build a card. Unlike games with similar mechanisms, these ancillary village actions are not necessarily worse, they're just different. The further you move, the more village actions you'll get when you stop. And timing when to land on a village is a fine trick, because these villages are broken up by cities. Frequently you'll have to move enough spaces and skip a city, asking you to forego perhaps an instrumental action, but then maybe you get to have a village action that lets you build the exact right card that powers up a different city action. Did I mention that there's an ability that makes it all better if you take a disc off? Finding the exact right village to land on is like firing that proton torpedo that takes out the Death Star. It's like finding the exact right spot to hug a grizzly bear, a spot that simultaneously tames it and doesn't outright maul you with its overbearing presence, and also lets you ride that bear into victory. That's an overall analogy, you might say, Efka, but you know what? Welcome to Maracaibo. But all of that is rendered meaningless if you haven't got the right cards. As we mentioned before, each card has 3 functions. You can spend it as a good when arriving at cities, you can spend it as an object when arriving at special locations which have been designated as quests, which let you forego a city or village action to instead claim the quest and its rewards, or you can build the card and unlock whatever ability it provides. Here's the thing, through a fairly tedious setup process, you will end up with a deck of about 80 cards. Those cards might or might not be the same in subsequent games. Each of them opens up potential new avenues and strategies to explore. Maybe one game you'll lean into privateering, another into exploring, or maybe you'll just rely on a cookie combination you've dreamt up, like building continuous copies of the Master Builder, which makes all future cards you build cheaper by 1, so then each next one you build increases that discount further, making cards perpetually cheaper. And also the Master Builder just happens to have a strong resemblance to annoying British comedian Jimmy Carr, who went to Elaine's school, by the way. And you think to yourself, do you know what? I'll call it the Jimmy Carr strategy, without realizing that for the rest of that playthrough, all you can hear in your head is that grating laughter. And you think to yourself, no, Efka, focus, strategize, but instead, not that that's ever happened to me, I'm just saying, the possibilities are endless. Okay, you've just settled on which cards you wanted to build, and oops, you've just spent the card that you reserved for delivering a good. The audacity of triple function cards is that your hand is in a constant battle with itself. Let's say that I really wanted the hub for its ability, but I also need the sugar that it has to deliver a good. That's fine, I have another sugar card, the Innkeeper, but the Innkeeper also has the object that I wanted to fulfill a quest. That's fine, I have another of the same object, but of course, I also wanted the ability on that card. And that's when I realized that Maracaibo is amazing, because in spite of its Byzantine intricate web of interlocking mechanisms and interactions and endless traps of indecision that'll make the best of us look like a caricature of Chini Anagonye, Maracaibo somehow remains not annoying, considered the game's two main scoring mechanisms. Each game you'll straddle the trapeze of exploration and fighting. If you lean into exploring, you'll set off on a track of copious rewards. Whenever you explore, you'll travel a number of spaces on this track. Let's say that in this example, we've been allotted free movement, which means I could land here and get myself 3 coins, or right here and get myself 2 points, or here and just get a measly coin, which is obviously worse than 3 coins. But if I do decide to land here, then I'm moving further along the exploration track, and the further I reach, the better the bonuses are. Not to mention that if I somehow manage to explore again, I will be able to hopscotch over all of these opponents for free and land on a space that gives me 3 points and 3 coins. Later in the track, not only can I reach spaces that'll make the 3 coins look like an underdone crumpet, that means just a little bit disappointing for all you non-British viewers, but if I'm efficient, I'll reach spaces that are better versions of the actions available on the board. And if I reach the end, I can straddle myself onto what is essentially a virtual catapult of victory points. There are also cards that will let you place an assistant on the map, permanently changing that location, but only for you. Now you have an operator working in the shadows. Maybe an innkeeper that's been gathering rumors and keeping a business running. Whenever you stop by, they'll provide you with a special action only available to you. When you start the game, there's scarcely an opportunity to explore on this board, and even then not very efficiently, but of course there's a card that if you build it, will allow you to place an assistant, and that assistant will allow you to perform an extra exploration every single round. Suddenly this crumpet starts looking very hot. I realize I just sexualized the crumpet, which really wasn't my intention. Fighting is slightly harder to explain because much like the rest of this game, it leans slightly on the convoluted side, but here's the gist. Each time you fight, you'll flip a token. That token tells you how much combat value you'll get depending on which nation you choose to fight for. Sometimes France will be strong, and sometimes England will be strong, and sometimes Spain will be strong. Which is of course funny because much like a real life not at all pirate, they would evaluate first which side is doing best before taking on the job. That seems like a non-decision because the combat value tells you how much fighting you can do. You can spend your combat value to either increase your influence or plonk that country's cube onto one of the cities to get a reward, or if you have enough combat value, both. And there's also other combat abilities if you take a disc off, also on cards. And just like that, the non-decision becomes the non-decision. Choosing which country to fight for is an investment. Your influence is multiplied by how many cubes have been plonked onto the map, and that's how many points you'll score extra at the end of the game. Your happy-go-lucky mercenary demeanor can go pack it in now, because now that you've made your bed with England, you'll keep wanting to fight for England, and you'll draw a combat token, and suddenly Spain gets all the combat value, and you'll say, Mum, I want to fight for England. And Mum, represented by the chaotically overbearing nature of this game, will reply, shut up and pick up a sword. Maracaibo sets up a special feeling of ownership. Each round you're straddled on a whirlwind that'll rip you through the Caribbean, or maybe just toss you aside. Turns out that being not at all a pirate isn't as freeing as you'd want it to be. The waves will sweep you aside onto expensive sidetracks or batter you into a pile of bad decisions just before you reach the finish line. Folks who've had the chance to try out Fista's previous cow gem, Great Western Trail, will recognize the circular nature of travel. Although it has its own signature spin, each game consists of exactly 4 rounds, and a round is finished when one person reaches the finish line, putting it in stark contrast to the cow delivery simulator. Great Western Trail asked you to weigh up how many rotations you could complete before the game's workers whittled themselves into an end state. Maracaibo asks you how long do you want to dawdle, traveling to various isles, hunting for opportunities, maybe increasing your victory point income. Imagine there's a victory point income track, meaning that at the end of each round, you will get a set number of victory points and you can increase that value, and then you look at yours and yours is like 6 and your opponent is like like that. You're like, I want to dawdle some more because there's opportunities for me to stop and increase that income victory point track until someone eventually reaches the ending and you're like, but wait, I wanted to do some more fighting and exploring for one last time. Maybe just another time before that one last time, and then maybe 5 more times before that other last one. And then the cycle repeats for another 3 rounds. Generally, you don't want to rush. After all, the more places you visit, the more you can exploit, the more you can make business. Whilst I spent quite a bit of time comparing Maracaibo to Great Western Trail, this game is still very much its own thing, even though they have a lot of the same juices coursing through their veins. Both games feature a dynamic map that evolves based on decisions you make. For better or worse, you get to build your own Caribbean and shape the path you'll trudge on. Maybe you'll establish a tavern, and now that's a business that will bring you money and gossip. And maybe that's exactly what you needed when you were a young and inexperienced sailor with hopes and dreams and not a cent in your pocket, yet still somehow you managed to build a tavern because rich parents, I don't know. But now that you've seen the riches the archipelago has to offer, the older you is cursing your younger self. What were you thinking? You did only have to evaluate about 17 billion different cards with free modes on each of them. Other juices are also available. Maracaibo doesn't just riff on Great Western Trail, but also Fista's other games. The fighting mechanism borrows heavily from Mombasa and its share system. The multifunctionality of cards sees an influence from both Oh My Goods and Blackout Hong Kong. Retaining, heck, not even just retaining, but molding your own sense of identity with so much graft and splice is a miracle as wondrous as Pinocchio. This isn't just a real boy, this is a well-worn ship battered by the waves, full of character and charm and graphical design that makes it look like someone drew a bunch of lightsabers onto the board. But now that we mentioned art, it's time to have the talk. Maracaibo is set in the Caribbean at the whooping heights of colonialism. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with a historical setting, but unlike something like our earlier reviewed Pax Pamir 2nd edition, this doesn't feel very well researched, aside from getting all the capital letter nouns right, nor does it feel like it has anything to say. There's hundreds and hundreds of cards with multitudes of different characters, and all of them, you guessed it, are indeed very white. In fact, scouring through the decks, I've only found 2 non-white characters, and one of them is called a native, which for a game set in the Caribbean feels just a smidge tone deaf. There's a reason I started this video with I love Eurogames, because I do. On mechanical merits, Maracaibo is a star. But with each passing year, the traditional German method of telling stories through games feels more and more out of touch, and by now it's reached a point where one of 2 things has happened. Either everyone involved in the development of Maracaibo was blithely oblivious, which needs to change, or this is willful diminishing of the subject, which also needs to change. And honestly, I can't believe I'm saying this, but I won't blame you if you ignore that, because Eurogames have a long-standing tradition of theme just serving as set dressing for mechanisms. It's not trying to tell a story, it's just imitating tropes for the sake of cohesion. No one buys these for rip-roaring adventure, we just want to dabble with the next take on deck building or rondelles or whatever. But here's where things get a little tricky, because Maracaibo, unlike Eurogames, does tell a story, or at least tries to. It's a campaign game which takes you through 11 chapters of a narrative and does some very innovative things when it comes to mechanical structure of campaign games. In fact, just the term campaign game alone is enough to drive copious amounts of fear into any board gamer's heart, because here's yet another box that you'll start with your friends and never finish. But wait, not only is there a fully functioning and great non-campaign version in the box, but also the open nature of the campaign mode makes it irrelevant whether you play it from the start or the finish, or you play it with the same people or a constantly revolving cast of friends. Each chapter will introduce new locations, evolving the Caribbean into a more and more complex and intricate puzzle, and that gradual growth offers something no Eurogame has done before: a slightly different gauntlet each time you sit down with new variables to consider and mechanical questions to crack. But the narrative itself, the text on these cards, I won't mince words. It's rubbish. Basic, predictable tosh that you'll find better versions of on a Tesco value box of cornflakes. A burrito with no burr to Ito. Which is a double dip into disappointment, considering that this could have been a chance to say something meaningful about this historical period. And I know, I'm expecting too much, because finding a designer that can craft something that's simultaneously an engrossing and mind-bending gauntlet of decisions, but also tells a fantastic story, I'm not even sure that person is out there. And that's fine. Don't do everything yourself. Delegate. Find someone, or get your publishers to find someone, or get a publisher who will find someone who'll do the narrative and do the story and do it justice. And whilst you're at it, maybe you could find a publisher with a good rulebook editor, because this was an actual pain to read. Or if you're not willing to do the work, then find a setting with no real world impact. Mr. Pfister, we love your work, but this is a call to action. You need to step up your game. And if it doesn't bother you, you heard everything you need to know whether you should get yourself a copy of Maracaibo, an otherwise triumphant epitome of Alexander Pfister's designs. Complete thematic misfires aside, I would be lying if I didn't admit that I loved carving out my path and watching that path grow based on the decisions I made. Every step had its own quirks, complications, and character. Not because of the tired trope of privateering, but because trying to unwrap this rhizomatic explosion of causality was a story unto itself. And that's Alexander Pfister's great power, and it's on best show here, even if ultimately Maracaibo doesn't introduce anything groundbreaking into the genre. If you enjoyed this video, then that makes me very happy, because untangling these big heavy Euro games is a lot of work. And if you appreciated that work, then give us a subscribe thing. Believe it or not, in this strange YouTube world, the subscribe things make our life a lot easier. Thank you very much.